Let's talk exposure for a few minutes. I'm going to assume you already know some of the basic principles of the exposure triangle. We're going to get into why and how. Generally, the most important thing is shutter speed. You want your shutter speed to be fast enough to freeze your subject, how you prefer, but slow enough, or as slow as possible, to allow the most light to come in, generally. Exceptions could be on a really bright day, you have a little more room to play with, but a lot of the time, getting the right exposure is a balance of the three elements because you generally don't have perfect lighting. I have a couple examples. They'll be a bit difficult to see as they're printed, but you can get the idea. So in a case like this, our subject isn't moving, and it's a bright day. So you'd probably be somewhere about around 1/500th of a second at the lower end. You could even go a little lower. And you could probably go up to 1/1000th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. I would generally opt towards the 1/500th of a second to 1/1000th of a second. This will give you more room to play with your aperture and your ISO. Now this image, the bird's flying. So you have less room to work with. You need to be at least 1/1500th of a second, preferably closer to 1/2000th or 1/3000th of a second to freeze that bird when it's flying. If you're shooting something like landscape on a tripod, you can really, unless the wind is blowing, you can use whatever shutter speed you like, given it works with your other three or your other two components of the exposure. So going back to the bird on the branch, we've set our shutter speed, let's say 1/500th of a second. It's plenty fast enough to freeze the bird as it's not really moving. So then I'll think about aperture. Generally, I try to keep it in the middle of the lens's range. So with the lens I shot this with, I believe it's f5.6 to f26 or something of that nature. I usually try to shoot it around f8 to f14. I want to ensure that the background has a nice blur. So I don't want to go too high. I'm not going to shoot f20, f28. Since we've already picked our shutter speed, we can kind of play around and see what aperture works by seeing how much it affects our ISO. In an ideal situation, I like my ISO to be somewhere between 100 and 1000. So, keeping that in mind, I'll set my aperture to say f9, and then check to see what ISO would provide me a correct exposure. In your camera, in your light meter, let's say we're at 1/500th of a second, f9, and 500 ISO. That could be totally wrong for this image, I'm just spitballing, but all of those three fit within my ranges of preference for an image of this nature. This is a well-lit subject, so it's a bit easier. This image, it's a little trickier. For an image like this, you get one chance of success. You see it sitting on the branch and you're guessing it's about to take off. You don't want to miss that moment. So to be safe, I'm going to set a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. From experience, I'm confident that will freeze this bird enough. It's on the lower end of what I know will freeze this image. This was an overcast day. There wasn't much piercing light. In fact, it was pretty gloomy. So I'm airing as low as possible of a shutter speed that I know will freeze it. Then aperture. Again, since I don't have a lot of light to work with, I'm going to go for the widest possible aperture that I'm confident will give me enough depth of field to get the important parts of the bird in frame. So in this case, I would probably do f7, f8, just enough to get a good amount of the bird in focus, but as wide as possible to let as much light in. After setting those two components, I'm left with ISO. Now, I always shoot in an auto ISO mode, so when I chose those two, I'm left with whatever the camera gives me for ISO. And in a situation like this, I'll take whatever I can get. This happened to be shot at ISO 6400, which is the top end of what my camera shoots. It will go higher, but that's when you're really starting to push it. I try not to shoot higher than 6400 if I can help it. With modern photo editing software and noise reduction, there's no issue with shooting at ISO 6400. Don't be afraid to. You might hear that you need to shoot at ISO 100, 400, 800. That's not true. In an ideal situation, of course, try to shoot as low as possible, but don't let that stop you from capturing a moment. You can see, maybe not perfectly, that it was captured just fine after doing a little bit of noise reduction. There's plenty of detail here in the face, which is what I want. Quick summary would be, first pick your shutter speed, then pick your aperture, then either pick your ISO to get a proper exposure on your light meter, or let the camera do it yourself, or let the camera do it itself. Now, since I shoot in auto ISO, I use the exposure compensation, but this principle also applies if you're manually setting it. So you have to consider when your camera is reading the light, sometimes there'll be points in your image that are much brighter than the rest. So if it's factoring that in and exposing to the brightest parts of the image, say this, there's a chance your subject could be too dark. So when you're figuring it out, first, to begin with, it might be helpful to take a test photo. Get an idea of what your camera is interpreting the light. Get an idea of how your camera's interpreting the light. So let's say we took a test photo and it said, the camera said it was properly exposed, but the shadow in the bird was still black. In that case, I would manually bump my ISO higher than what it says is a proper exposure, or set your exposure compensation to plus 0.3 stops, plus 0.7 stops, or plus 1 stop. Whatever makes your subject properly exposed. In this case, our subject is closer to the black side of things rather than the light side of things. There's a lot of dark shadows, and there's nothing too bright about it. So, when I'm taking this exposure, I'm going to make sure that none of the shadows are clipping black. If my camera does that automatically, great. If I take a first image and it's clipping black, I'm going to adjust the exposure to be brighter than what my camera thinks is correct. Most cameras do a pretty good job, but there will be times where you have to compensate manually. If I were to base my exposure off of, say, this, and have this properly exposed, everything would be too dark. So you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on your subject. I take a lot of photography in the snow. The snow is notoriously bright. So in an image like this, it's pretty small, but you get the idea. If I were to expose to what my camera said is proper exposure, my subject would be nearly black. Therefore, I manually adjust the image to be brighter than the camera thinks it should be, to make sure that there are no clipping shadows in the subject. This makes the background and the snow either clipping or very high on the histogram, but you can't win them all. I would rather have a washed out background and a properly exposed subject than a properly exposed background and a subject you can't see.